Hello, my name's Janine McKenzie and I'm from Morrison Low. We're a local government focused consulting practice that's been engaged by Tamworth Regional Council to undertake a financial sustainability review with them and help them identify options to ensure their ongoing financial sustainability into the future. This is a recorded presentation of the materials that were presented at the public forums for Tamworth Regional Council on its proposed special rate variation from the 17th to the 19th of October for those people who were not able to attend the presentation. The objective of the forum was to provide information on the challenges, financial challenges facing council, as well as what is a special rate variation, what is the process that council must undertake when considering them, the outlining of the proposed special rate variation being considered and the reasons for it, and to provide the opportunity for questions and answers around any of the information presented. By the end of the session, hopefully you'll be better informed and understand how to express your views. I'll also talk about, if you're watching this recorded session, where you might go if you have questions for them to be answered. The presentation covers the Council's current financial position, what is a special rate variation, the proposed special rate variation being considered and why it's needed, the impact on average rates, the SRV process and next steps. It doesn't cover or review Council's delivery program or community strategic plan or make any decisions around whether the forums were never intended to make any decisions around whether or not to apply for a special rate variation. Councils generally in New South Wales have to balance the provision of services, infrastructure and regulatory functions with the funding and available to the council. Councils have three main sources of funding. Firstly, the community, either through rates or through specific fees and charges for certain services. Councils, like any other organisation, can go to financial institutions and raise debt to fund a variety of different projects, infrastructure or services. And councils are also able to access grants and contributions from either state and federal government. Sometimes these grants and contributions are tied to specific projects or initiatives, and there are other grants and contributions that are untied and just contribute to council's general revenue. Council also has to consider intergenerational equity. So what we mean by that is that it has to consider who's paying for the service or the asset and who's receiving the benefit of the service or the asset, and make sure that that is balanced effectively between the current ratepayer base and also the future ratepayer base of the council area. There are some obligations on council that are set out in Section 8B of the Local Government Act that require councils to apply sound financial management principles. These focus on ensuring that council is spending responsibly and sustainably, and also importantly that it aligns general revenue with expenses in that it doesn't spend more than it earns. When we talk about financial sustainability of a local government, of a council, there are five main areas that we focus on. So firstly is what's called a fully funded operating position. If council was a business, this would be their profit and loss. Unlike businesses, council isn't focused on making a profit. It needs to at least break even, but we always try to plan for modest surpluses in a future projection, just so that council has some ability to deal with those shocks and unpredictable events that happen, particularly, weather events like we've seen in recent years can have an impact on council's operating position. Secondly, like any other organisation or business, cash is also important to council, so it needs to make sure that it has a sufficient cash position. When you look at a balance sheet of council, generally, you might see that there's a significant amount that councils hold a significant amount of cash. quite a lot of that cash is what we call restricted, and there's two types of restrictions on council's cash. First is what we call external restrictions, which is where the restriction is in place from a piece of external legislation. An example of this might be developer contributions. So under the appropriate legislation, council has to collect those developer contributions and hold them and only expend them on the purpose for the purpose in which they've been collected. The second type of restriction is called internal restrictions, and that's where councils make a resolution to set aside funds for a certain initiative or project or asset. So these are internal because they're internal decisions of council based on a resolution to set that money aside. When you take the total amount of cash that the council has and you take out external and internal restrictions, what you have left is called unrestricted cash. That unrestricted cash is the cash that we focus on when we look at financial sustainability, because that's the cash that council has to ensure that it is able to fund its day-to-day operations. Councils also have significant assets that it owns, operates on behalf of its community. So it's important when we're looking at financial sustainability to make sure that councils have an appropriately funded capital program and that they're reinvesting into those assets and maintaining their asset base at a fit for purpose level. So that's at the level and condition that has been agreed with the community. And finally, councils under a variety of different pieces of legislation have a number of compliance obligations. So it needs to make sure that it has adequate resources to meet those obligations. When we talk about the requirements under Section 8B and the need for councils to apply sound financial management principles, these are not negotiable. Failure to meet these obligations can and have led to intervention by the Minister and Office of Local Government. There are two main types of intervention that the Minister and the Office might use. The first is they may put in place performance orders over a council, and that is can be a variety of different instructions that the Minister and the Office of Local Government put in place over that council. An example, the most recent example of that that having been implemented would probably be in Kiama Council. The other more extreme intervention that we see when councils fail to comply to applying sound financial management principles would be where the council is suspended or potentially dismissed and an administrator is put in place. And the most recent example of that occurring in New South Wales would be at Central Coast Council. So the sustainability challenge, what is the sustainability challenge for Tamworth Regional Council? Well, it's not that much different to many other councils in New South Wales. The council has experienced over an extended number of years that their costs are growing faster than their funds, their sources of funds. So they're operating in an environment where costs, we've got a relatively high level of inflation that over the last couple of years has been around 6 or 7%. We've also seen out of COVID a competitive labour market, which is putting pressure on wages, but particularly it's making it difficult for councils or organisations generally to attract and retain skilled staff, particularly in certain areas. And that is juxtaposed with the constricting funding sources that council is experiencing. So councils in New South Wales operate under a rate pegging regime, and that means that there is a maximum percentage that council can increase its ordinary and general rates by each year. That percentage is set by the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, IPART, where in the last 2 years we've seen, last year's rate peg being about 2.5%. This current financial year's rate peg was approximately 3.7%, and that's in an environment where we've seen costs, inflation, CPI grow by 6 and 7% each year. So the rate peg hasn't kept up with inflation. At the same time, with this high inflation has come increasing interest rates. So the council's cost of raising debt has grown. And at this, and in time with that, also we've seen both at the state and federal level budgetary constraints being put in place. So councils can't rely on the grants and contributions that it's received in the past into the future. For Tamworth, what we've seen is in the last 3 years, rates have increased by about 8% compounded. Whereas payroll, the cost of staff has increased by 17%, and the cost of materials, or the expenditure on materials, has increased by 81%. The increases in payroll predominantly have been driven from the New South Wales Local Government State Award, but there's also been increases in the superannuation guarantee percentages that most organisations have had to absorb. For the increase in expenses, and in part also, the increase in materials, but also in part the payroll increase, some of this is being brought about by increasing costs, so increasing prices, but there also is a proportion of this increase that has been just council doing more. So particularly in the roads maintenance, with the recent weather events and flooding events that the council has experienced, they've had the access to funding to be able to do more in terms of rehabilitating those roads as a result. What has council done to manage this? So over the last few years, council's done a fair bit. They've identified and implemented 189 improvement initiatives, and that saved council about $7.9 million per annum and $3.2 million in one-off costs. They've also got in place a plan for a further 24 initiatives over the next 4 years, which will provide council with an additional saving of $1.6 million annually and $2.2 million in one-off costs. They have also identified another 14, so that $1.6 and $2.2 million savings has been factored into the long-term financial plan. There are another 14 initiatives that council have identified that they just need to do a bit more work on, both in terms of costing, the cost of implementing, but also and how to implement, but also the benefits before they're built into the long-term financial plan. Council's also identified 10 initiatives where it needs to invest in additional resources to ensure its ongoing operational sustainability, and that will cost council $740,000 in one-off costs and $1.1 million in annual costs. These initiatives are focused predominantly on workforce, so they include improved investment into strategic workforce planning, training and development, but also workplace health and safety. Council's also looked at other opportunities or other areas where it can support its ongoing financial sustainability, and a few examples of these include land sales. So Tamworth Regional Council has the Tamworth Global Gateway Park. Land sales from this is used to repay the loans, but also to unlock the next tranche of assets in that space. They also have been looking at innovative service solutions, so looking to deliver more with less, either by using volunteers, but also reviewing facility opening hours to get best value for money. Council also has and continues to seek support from state and federal government, particularly around it seeks to optimise grants for new assets. So there are some significant projects or significant strategies in place around Ray House and the Performing Arts Centre that are not included in the proposed special variation, because council wants to make sure that it has the commitments from state and federal grants before these progress. The council has also invested quite significantly in technology. It has a digital transformation roadmap that it's working towards, which will improve staff productivity, but also customer experience. When we look at council's financial positions, particularly when we're looking at it from a financial sustainability perspective, we need to look at separating out those parts of council that operate almost as standalone businesses or functions. So that is where the revenue that is received specifically for those functions is dedicated to the operations and to the expenditure of those functions. So those are things like water, sewer, domestic waste. They're all separate, what we call funds, because they're kind of standalone businesses. When we take those out, or what's left is called the general fund, and the general fund is where the rates revenue sits, but it's also where most of council's services and functions are provided or funded from. When we look at the general fund over the last 5 years, we can see that there's been a pretty persistent deficit in that fund, in that operating result. And when that happens, generally speaking, when that happens, councils often have to look at their own internal unrestricted cash reserves to ensure that they can continue to provide those services. And as you can see from the bottom graph, that's what's happened at Tamworth Council. You can see a depletion of their unrestricted cash over the 5 years, trying to fill that deficit gap. We looked at a number of different alternatives for Tamworth Council. We looked at the do nothing, or the base case. This is just continuing as council currently is, where rates are subject to the rate peg and council just continues to deliver services and assets as planned. And I'll talk you through in a few more slides what that base case looks like for council. We looked at 2 other scenarios for council. Firstly, the sustainability scenario, and this include all the asset expenditure and project that council has either committed to or needs to do to ensure ongoing sustainability. This scenario can't be achieved without increasing rates by more than the rate peg. So we did look at a number of different alternative options around a special variation on this scenario. We looked at a 1-year increase, and this is not recommended because the impact on ratepayers would be quite significant. We looked at a 2-year rate increase, which is the recommendation that we've been talking to the community about. I'll talk through what that looks like in a few more slides in this presentation. We did also look at more than 2 years. As you get out more than 2 years, what happens is that because the incremental increase is getting smaller and smaller, and the rate peg, is assumed, but we don't know what it looks like, particularly given that IPART has recently undertaken a review of the rate pegging methodology. And once we lock in a special rate, once a special rate variation is approved, council has to wear the risk of the volatility in that rate peg into future years, which means that we couldn't guarantee that council was going to be able to unlock the kind of value it needed to deliver that sustainability scenario. The growth scenario was also looked at, and this included a number of those larger projects like the Performing Arts Centre and Ray Walthouse. This was not the recommended scenario because there's more work that needed to be done, both in terms of the design and the case for these larger projects, but also council wanted to ensure that the funding commitments from state and federal government were secured so that, before the projects would proceed, that there was a minimum impact on ratepayers as a result. So when we look at the base case and looking at those financial sustainability components that we talked about a few slides ago, what you can see for the base case in the operating result is, aside from a couple of small surpluses, over the first 6 to 8 years, it's predominantly a persistent deficit in the base case, especially when we take out those land sales. So when we take out those land sales, you can see that there's a pretty persistent deficit. That's the red line in the graph that you see there. It also didn't enable council to fully invest in renewing its assets. So there is an asset renewal ratio that councils are required by the Office of Local Government to report on each year. That ratio is basically the proportion of planned expenditure on capital renewal of assets divided by the amount of money that council would need to spend to ensure that the assets are maintained at their current level. So the target for that asset renewal ratio is 100%. And as you can see from that top graph, under the base case, council isn't able to sustain that 100% renewal ratio. In fact, over the 10-year forecast, it's an average of about 60.6%. When councils aren't able to sustain 100 or more percent in the asset renewal ratio, what we see is that the council's backlog grows. So the backlog is the amount of money that council has to spend to get all of its assets up to a satisfactory condition. Under the base case scenario, over the 10-year forecast period, that asset backlog ratio grows. It grows from 0.3% of the total asset value to 1.7% of the total asset value by the end of the 10-year forecast period. Now, this is still below the 2% benchmark set by the Office of Local Government, but it is, you can see that trend is a pretty straight line trend, so it would continue beyond that time frame. We looked at the sustainability scenario, and the sustainability scenario has all the same basic assumptions as the base case in terms of cost increases, staffing increases, all those kind of things. But what it does do predominantly is it removes that asset funding gap. So it actually makes sure that council has allocated the amount of money it needs to effectively renew and maintain its assets at the current condition. It also includes a number of different projects in the sustainability scenario. These are projects that are either have funding commitments associated with them, so they have grant commitments that are associated with them. They may be part of an endorsed strategy that council needs to execute. They may be required for a particular reason, such as the rehoming pound, or they may be addressing a backlog in certain asset areas like buildings and stormwater infrastructure. The sustainability scenario also includes the savings and costs from council's 24 improvement initiatives and 10 organisational sustainability initiatives that I talked about previously. Two-thirds of what we're going to talk about as the increase that would come about by the proposed special rate variation will be invested into addressing the renewal and maintenance gap in council's road infrastructure. So that would be a $4.7 million per annum increase in roads renewal over the 10-year forecast, and a $4 million per annum increase in roads and maintenance and operations. It's important to note too that roads infrastructure, 75% of the expenditure that council expends on roads is in areas outside of the Tamworth city area. The sustainability scenario isn't viable without an SRV, without a special rate variation. And as you can see that from the red line in each of those two graphs, if council were to attempt to try to deliver all of that without increasing rates, it would see an operating deficit over the 10-year forecast period of an average of $10.9 million. And effectively, it would run out of unrestricted cash within a couple of years. So what is a special rate variation? So as I mentioned earlier, New South Wales councils operate under a rate peg regime, which is determined by the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, IPART, each year. If councils need to increase their total general rates by more than the rate peg, they must apply to the official IPART for a special variation to their rates. Now, over time, the graph below shows the last sort of 5, 6, 8 years. Over time, the rate peg hasn't really kept pace with either wage inflation in local government or just general inflation, which means that, almost every council in New South Wales needs to consider a special rate variation at some point. Since 2011, This is when IPART took over the assessment and review of special rate variations on behalf of the Office of Local Government. There's 128. There's now 128 councils in New South Wales. Only 40 have not received a special rate variation of any size. Over that same period, 48 councils have been successful in obtaining a special rate variation more than once. The special rate variation that Tamworth Regional Council is considering is a 2-year permanent increase. That is in the first year, so 2024-25, the increase would be 18.5%. So that means the rate base would grow, the total rate revenue would grow by 18.5%. In the second year, the increase would be 15%. That is 15% on top of the rate base that had already increased by 18.5% the previous year. And then that new rate base after the second year would remain in place and continue, and increases off of that rate base into future years would be based on whatever the rate peg was set at. The cumulative impact of that 2-year permanent special rate variation would be 36.3%. If council were successful in increasing their rates by the 36.3% permanent increase over 2 years, that would allow council to ensure that it had surpluses over the 10-year forecast. The average surplus would be about $7.2 million per annum, or about 3.3% of its total revenue. It also would allow council to adequately invest in its assets. So that means that renewal ratio that we talked about before is now above 100%, which means that council is able to sufficiently invest in renewing its assets to maintain them at least their current condition. And as a result of that, the backlog ratio stays much stable at an average of about 0.6% over the 10-year forecast period. It also means that council is able to make good use of its cash reserves. So it keeps a unrestricted cash balance above zero, but it's also making sure that it's investing in those assets over the 10-year period. So that's the impact on council. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact on rates, and especially on average rates. So it's important to note that when we're talking about the impact on rates, the residents get a rates bill that has a number of different line items on it, and the increase that we're talking about only applies to ordinary rates. So those are the first 2 lines of your rates notice. The other lines, such as sewer, stormwater, water, and domestic waste, are not impacted, will not change as a result of the special rate variation proposed. Now, we're also only going to talk about average rates, because average rates will give you a bit of an indication, but we can't talk about everybody's individual rates. But the council does have a rates calculator on their Have Your Say page. If you use the link that, or just Google Tamworth special rate variation, and you'll find the Have Your Say page. You can go in there and put in your own personal details about your own property or properties, and you can then see what the rate impact, the proposed impact would be from the special rate variation. So over the course, we've tried to provide you with some average increases across a number of the different localities, as recognising that there's some differences in a lot of the localities across the Tamworth region, and these two tables here give you the total increase over the 2-year special rate variation implementation period for the average rates in each of these areas, both residential, and business rates. But it also gives you an indication of what that looks like as a weekly increase, so that you can sort of see what that might look like to a weekly wage. We've also given you some comparison information. So the Office of Local Government group councils into a number of different groupings. Tamworth Regional Council is part of a group that is regional towns and cities. And there's 26 councils in that grouping. So there's quite a number of councils and they are quite diverse. So we've given the comparisons here to the councils that Tamworth Regional Council are most similar to within that group, but we've also given you a comparison to the OLG group average as well. So for the average Tamworth residential rate under the base case, which is $1,270.16, under the 2-year special rate variation, it would be $1,631.59. And you can see that under the 2-year special rate variation, it does bring the average residential rate above the Office of Local Government Group average, but still, middle of the range in terms of some of those other comparable councils. We did do some analysis for council around some of the socioeconomic indicators and impacts that would happen, and looked at some capacity to pay considerations for the council. The way we did that was we grouped the local government area into 5 smaller areas that each had relatively consistent CEFA rankings. So CEFA stands for Socioeconomic Indicator for Area. This is the Australian Bureau of Statistics looking at every area in Australia and rating them from the highest socioeconomic to the lowest socioeconomic levels. And that's the rankings, the CEFA rankings that we're talking about. And you can see on the graph or the picture on the right of this slide, these were the groupings that we used. What we found was the lowest household income and CEFA index areas were Tamworth, Oxley and Westdale, and Manila, Barraba and Rural North. The localities with the lowest CEFA index in the LGA were South and West Tamworth. But these were also areas that had lower land values, so the impact of the rate increase was commensurate a little bit or softened a little bit by those lower land values. The other thing that council is considering is, in particularly in one of those lower socioeconomic areas, Tamworth, Oxley and Westdale, there was a higher proportion of renters versus actual residential ratepayers. Renters are obviously, or would obviously be impacted by a rate increase, but just their impacts would be different in nature. And so council's just considering that kind of option. Council's also undertaking a review of its hardship policies at the moment to make sure that there is avenues for those ratepayers that are really struggling with these type of increases, that they are able to get some relief. In terms of business rates, you can see the average local government area business rate under the base case would be $4,406.89. Under the 2-year special variation being proposed at the end of the 2 years, it would be $5,660.88. And again, similar to the residential rates, it does bring it up above the OLG group average, but it still sits very much within the middle of the pack in terms of those comparator councils. Farming. So when we talk about farming and mining, we just got to bear in mind that even, averages are good comparisons. They do have their pitfalls, but particularly when we're talking about farming and mining, the comparisons get less and less secure, I suppose, in that even across these 26 councils in the OLG group and in the comparator councils, the nature of farming and mining in each of these council areas can be very, very different. The size of the farms and mines, what they do, will all impact the average amount that is set for each of these councils. But just for completeness, we've given the farming comparisons. The base case, under the base case, the average farming rate would be $2,278.72 at the end of the proposed SRV rate increase path. And under the 2-year SRV, that would be $2,927.13. And you can see it's still, again, above the OLG group average, but well within the middle of the range. And you can see there's a bit more volatility, a bit more variability in the average rates for those comparator councils in the farming area. There's a lot more information and supporting documents that Council has on its Have Your Say page if you want to go there for further information. It also gives you some information on how to reach out to Council either through a short survey, via email, via phone. If you have questions that the information on the website or this presentation haven't been able to answer for you, you're also on the website able to take a short survey. And Council has updated its long-term financial plan at the same time, and has put this on exhibition at the same time as we're going through this community engagement around the special rate variation. So you are able to provide a submission either on the special rate variation and or on the long-term financial plan, if you so wish. So what happens next? So from the 18th, this community engagement period started on the 18th of September 2023 and will go to the 31st of October 2023. Once the consultation period closes, the information, all the submissions and feedback received in that consultation period will be presented to Council in a report that will go to Council in November, where they will then have the opportunity to make a decision about whether or not they want to proceed and apply for a special rate variation. If Council does decide to apply for a special rate variation, it will need to lodge that application by early February. We understand that's about the 5th of February, but as of the date of this recording, it hadn't been, that information had yet to be published on IPART's website. So exactly. Between March and April next year, IPART will evaluate its applications, assess all the applications, and they will also invite submissions from anyone who wants to make any comment on any of the applications that it receives for special rate variations. In May 2024, IPART then will make a determination, or makes its determination on the application. And finally, the last decision is that if Council is successful and a special rate variation is approved, when in June 2024 Council will adopt its rates, its next financial year's rates to start from the 1st of July 2024, it then makes the decision about whether it will apply all or part of the approved special rate variation in its rates. Finally, the IPART have a number of criteria that it must assess special rate variations against, and those criteria are: the need and purpose for the special rate variation is clear and articulated in Council's main planning documentation, that there is evidence that the community is aware of the need and extent of the rate rise, that the impact on affected ratepayers must be reasonable, that relevant IP&R documents, IP&R stands for Integrated Planning and Reporting, and that these documents are exhibited, approved and adopted by the Council, that either in the IP&R documents or in Council's application, it explains and quantifies the productivity improvement and cost containment strategies that it has both implemented and also that it plans to implement in coming years. And finally, there's a criteria that is any other matters that IPART consider relevant, that IPART usually makes some comment about these when it actually publishes its information papers each year for the particular rate variation it's assessing. So that concludes the presentation of this information. We had in the forums, there was a question and answer session that ensued after the presentation, but I would point anybody watching this recording back to Council's Have Your Say page. There is a variety of ways you can connect to Council if you have any questions, but there's also a lot more information, a lot more detailed information on the webpage that you could look at if you wanted to investigate further. Thank you very much.